Hey everyone. Good morning. Well, it's morning in my time. I'm in Los Angeles, speaking to you from my garage. But thanks for joining today. This has been a journey, a very long and in many ways painful journey. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about FieldKit and then what we've learned from it. And there's, the whole idea around product development is quite big. And so maybe you'll kind of get a sense of things you should start thinking about if you're in the same position. Let me share my. Okay, can you see the presentation? Is that good?
Yeah, we can. That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So if you don't know me, I have been working in the conservation technology space for about over a decade now. I started a nonprofit that's called Conservify that's really focused around how to build products, actually how to work on conservation technologies just in general. And everything we do is open source. This is our lab in downtown LA. And we started the FieldKit project there. FieldKit has since kind of evolved and become its own organization. So FieldKit is its own nonprofit that's separate from Conservify, but a lot of the same people work on both of them. So Conservify has worked on lots of projects all over the world. We've done a bunch of work in the Amazon and in the Canadian Rockies, and a lot of the stuff that we were building during that time has been more focused on this is a project that we have with a partner. Let's build up this technology and test it and then deploy it on an expedition, right? The goal was always, let's deploy this technology on an expedition, gather data, and then that project either moves on or like is complete at that point. We started thinking about, okay, there might be a different way to do things, and that's where FieldKit came, and that's why we got deep into product development on the FieldKit side of things. So FieldKit itself, I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but we ended up going down this journey a few years ago, and we won the Hackaday Prize for product design, and that was a $125,000 prize. So that was validation that a lot of the things that we're thinking about were kind of the right things to be thinking about in that space. And so I'll tell you a little bit about some of those lessons coming up. But first, okay, project versus product, what's the difference? In my mind, really, most things should be projects unless they meet a few certain criteria, right? If you're building something and you think, okay, this has the potential to impact a lot more people, but the limitations are my team's ability to build it, maintain it, deal with it. So that is one indicator that maybe you need to think about, okay, how do we transition something into something that's built more for scale? This involves thinking a lot about who's actually going to use this, right? Like the effort to turn something into a product might not make sense if there's only going to be 20 people that are using it. But there's a lot of the thinking that goes behind product development that can actually help in this whole thing. The other thing to think about when you're building a product is what about the thing that you're doing that makes it different when it comes to everything else that's out there for other people to choose? What's your competitive advantage, or what gap are you filling in that space? That's a really good indicator. If it's a very clear gap, or you see that this is something that's really, really needed and there's a lot of demand out there, then yeah, okay, it makes sense to build it into a product. And it's also important to kind of think about how complicated that sort of development would be. So, at Conservify, we still build projects all the time. We hack together things using dev boards and all sorts of different things to make it work. But we focused a lot on how do we build FieldKit into something that makes the most sense for the most people. So the very first lesson I have is definitely don't do this during a pandemic. It has made literally every single part of this thing more complicated by multitudes. The supply chain issues, the shipping issues, just being able to work with a team and build hardware in a distributed way during this pandemic. It's all been really, really difficult. And hopefully we're coming to the end of this. And so this isn't something that you really have to think about much. But I mean, everything got more complicated when COVID hit. So FieldKit, there's more information about FieldKit if you aren't familiar with it at fieldkit.org. But basically what it was we started doing it as a project. We started working on how do we build environmental sensors that could be used in the Okavango Delta or in other places. And we were manufacturing them in my garage or in the lab and then taking these things out on expeditions. But then we started to think, okay, well, let's reimagine FieldKit. And this was a couple years ago. We actually, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we found the right funder to allow us to do that. And then we thought, okay, well, let's envision FieldKit as this open source software and hardware platform, and that really enables the most amount of people to be able to do this sort of work. And how do we do it in a way that is scientifically relevant? And so we put a lot of thought into that. So originally, FieldKit was geared towards the scientists that we were working with on these conservation projects. And then we did a lot of work with education on the side, just because that's a personal passion of mine. But then when we started thinking about it as a product, that user base grew, and it grew quite a bit. And I'll talk a little bit about how we found that user base, but we started thinking about what does FieldKit look like if it's being used by citizen scientists or, in environmental justice sort of situations. How do hackers and data artists and makers and all those sorts of people make use of FieldKit, or municipalities? And so we started thinking a lot bigger. And once you start thinking in that sort of way, then the sort of questions that you ask yourself as you're developing this technology change quite a bit. And it really, the way that you're developing it from a user standpoint and how you communicate things about the technology to people, all that stuff changes depending on who your audience is, right? So, field scientists can be very forgiving in terms of a lot of technical jargon and stuff like that. But if you're talking to makers or citizen scientists, they probably won't be. And it's really important to kind of think about that. So I think, in hindsight, one of the biggest mistakes we made was the ambition behind what we were building. If you're starting down the path of building a product and you've never built one before, start with one product, start small. With FieldKit, we have basically 3 separate products. We have the hardware, which is a big ecosystem of hardware that we've been developing from scratch. Basically the board designs are all ours. We have a mobile app, and it's not even an easier kind of mobile app that just has to live within the app ecosystem. It has to also talk to hardware, which has its complications if you've ever used, GoPro apps or anything like that. And then the last is a kind of a website that allows for data visualization and project management and all this sort of stuff as a result of it. And so, when I think about what we did, that scope was a little too big for us to first walk into. The second kind of lesson I'll give is, if you are designing hardware, it's really great to use modules or reference designs to kind of get your head around what those first prototypes should end up looking like. For modules, we use modules for things like screens or Wi-Fi or GPS, stuff that we don't really want to have to design ourselves, LoRa, those sorts of technologies. But we designed everything else from the ground up. Originally, FieldKit, when we moved off of development boards, was using, a reference design. We were using a different, another open source design that we modified and kind of adapted. But as we've kind of moved down this path, our boards have become more and more complicated, and we have a lot more of them. And so we've somewhat moved away from that. But if you're just getting into product design, it's really important to kind of pick the battles that you need to pick the battle that are most relevant. And so if it makes sense to use a microcontroller, power charging circuitry, whatever, off of another board, and that works, you've tested it, then definitely use that. The other side of things is, modules and the suppliers can actually like make or break you. There's a lot of rigor that goes into figuring out what parts you want to get and where you want to get them from. And everybody makes mistakes in this place. So if you have this issue where you buy a bunch of something and they don't work quite right, just realize that every single person who's built a product has been in that same space as yours. For us, we spent a good portion of this year redesigning our water quality boards, because we had a supplier that some of you might be familiar with, that was providing us these little modules that we're putting on our boards, and we just ran into a ton of problems with them. They weren't holding calibration. They weren't giving us the data accuracy when we wanted to. And so we made the tough decision earlier this year to say, you know what, we're just scrapping that. We're going to take a loss on the parts that we bought, and we're going to redesign them. And it turns out now we're sitting here and it's all for the better, because we're the product we've decided is something that I think we're all really proud of. The accuracy and precision is much better, and it's something that we're going to make available even beyond just FieldKit, but to the community, the greater community who wants to like plug Arduinos and stuff into these sorts of things. But that was a very expensive and a costly mistake in terms of time. But it's something that just happens once you kind of move down this path. The choosing the right components is a really important part of building a hardware project. So this has been something that I think has been elevated as of recently, but there's a lot that goes into the choice of the different components that you put on your board. You have to think about, how popular is this? Are there other people using it? Is it freely available? How close is that part to its end of life? What do you know about the company that's selling it? Are there counterfeit versions of these things out that you might have to worry about? There's a lot that you kind of have to think about with respect to what you're choosing to actually put on your boards. But then the bigger part that we've seen as of recently is the supply chain, right? I mean, this has been a major thing that we've dealt with since the pandemic started, and since the chip manufacturers went through the issues that they did, is parts just disappearing because Apple decides that they want to buy up the world's stock of isolators or something like that, right? And so, Bradley is our hardware designer, and he spent a significant part of the last year just chasing parts. And, when we talk to other people in this space, we realize it's sort of the same thing. And so if you made the wrong decision from a product standpoint, that I want to use this GPS chip, and then all of a sudden that GPS chip isn't available until 2023, then you have to either decide, okay, I'm just going to redesign my board, or I'm going to do this. And chasing this thing has been something that a lot of people in the industry now, because of the pandemic, have gone through. But there's lessons to be learned. Like, there's better ways to kind of do that. So we should sort of think about that moving forward. But it's bad right now. I mean, there's supply chain managers that are just sitting on like DigiKey and mouse, or refreshing their screen just to wait to see if any stock drops, so that they can end up building these sorts of things. Designing for manufacturing. So this is design for manufacturing, assembly, and test is something in the engineering world they call it DFMAT. And the whole idea behind that is, how can you design your boards in a way that it makes it very easy to build them? And so an idea of this would be, this is like something that a mistake that people make all the time. It's like, how do you lay out your board so that when you're putting all those components on, that you're not obscuring your access by your hands to place other things, making things that are awkward to build or cause issues with yield. So you're having a lot of boards that aren't actually passing tests because there's an issue with them. That is a problem that could be frustrating for you as a person to build your circuit boards, but it also can be expensive once you decide that you want other people building your circuit boards. So there's other implications, like, is this able to be picked up by a pick and place machine? Do you have to hand solder certain things? There's a lot of this stuff can cause frustration. So it usually it's worth it to sit back and do a review of your board. And the great thing about being in conservation technology is that there's a lot of people who are really excited about the work that we do. So even if you just want somebody to take a look and give you some advice, like, the opportunity to find somebody to do that is actually a lot easier for us than it is for people in other industries. The other part is, this is mostly targeted to people building hardware, is that software is important. It's an important part of it. I've had so many funders tell me that they struggle with hardware projects because a lot of times people building the hardware treat the, what to do with the data afterwards, or how do you interface with the hardware, as an afterthought. And that seems like, you build this beautiful piece of hardware, but then you have to use like these really clunky methods to upload firmware, or you have to, to take the data off, you have to plug in 12 adapters and use this weird obscure software. Like, that is an issue with the user experience that you should kind of think about. So we've thought about that a lot with FieldKit. That was something very early on that we learned. And so we decided we wanted an app because we don't want everybody who has to use the FieldKit to have like some sort of software coding experience. So let's create an interface that people know how to deal with, and it's an app, right? We all use apps every single day. But then also, like, once you have that data, then what do you do with it? An easy way, if you don't necessarily have the capacity or bandwidth to do something bigger, is you can always find a good tool that is commercially available, like for data visualization or whatever, and then make your product work really well with that. We did that in the early days, but we decided we wanted to kind of build our own data portal that allows that for a lot of that information. So we had been focused on that recently, but that software stuff, it takes a lot of work. I mean, I think our own internal release of the app, we're like on the 1500th version or something of the release of the app. So it's just constant development because bugs and all the things you find. But that's a great thing about software, is you can do that a lot easier than you can do that with hardware. The other thing, another lesson that I will share is that documentation is incredibly important. And particularly, we're an open source organization, both Consumerify and FieldKit, 100% open source. And the one of the main areas where open source projects fall down is in documentation. So like, there's always a better job you can do about it. But one of the interesting things that I've learned in making FieldKit and trying to make a product that's available to people all across the world is like, there's a lot of cultural differences in terms of how people like documentation or would use the documentation. So, there's communities that we work with that really want to have a piece of paper that something's written down on how to do it. There's a lot, other communities that would love a very detailed product guide with tutorials and all this sort of things. And some of the projects that we work on too, the only way that this will work is if that documentation is in the form of short, small videos that can be shared peer-to-peer, like over phones and stuff. So, we've thought a lot about like what does it make sense in terms of how people want to digest this information. I mean, we use traditional sources, like you can find all the information on GitHub, and we built a forum in FieldKit that, because we haven't pushed out a lot of product due to the pandemic, is not very active at the moment. But, a lot of the thought of our community managers around how do we build these things better that are going to work well for, a user. And that user can be anything from a grade school student all the way up to, a PhD in environmental sensors, right? And how does it work well for those kinds of users? But also, if somebody wants to take FieldKit and build their own modules or hack into FieldKit or create their own versions of it. So what is that technical documentation that we have to provide as well? So that's something that I would say start early, because it's always going to feel like a giant mountain that will never go away. But with respect to testing, there's like never enough testing that you can end up doing. Testing, for all different parts of it. This is like a part of our case that we designed just to test a certain waterproof aspect of it. But we do the same with like circuit boards, right? So before you design like the full up circuit board, you're going to create the little subsystems. Maybe it's the charging subsystem or battery management or whatever it is, and you test those thoroughly, and you integrate that into the larger thing. And if you have a really strict testing regimen that goes through your prototyping phase, your manufacturing phase, and acceptance after manufacturing, and then after that you need to test it with users to make sure that these things make sense. I mean, we paid random people off the street to come in and use FieldKit without telling them anything about it, just to see what sort of things they struggled with, right? We had testing where our team went out and tried to figure things out. We've worked with communities to test a bunch of stuff. And every single time you do any of this sort of testing, like, you get these amazing insights back, and it's really on you as a person developing the product to kind of look back and think about what that, how you can improve the stuff that you're doing as a result of that. This is, for people who are more technical, this might seem like it's not important, but it's really important to think about the design of the stuff that you're building and everything around kind of how you represent FieldKit. And so we have a designer on staff that that works around like creating, okay, if we're talking about FieldKit, here's what our style guide ends up looking like. One thing that we've done that I think is really quite great, and a lot of people should think about, is like, if you ever need illustrations done for your stuff, it's really easy to find very talented illustrators and cartoonists out there, and they're not expensive. I mean, when we first put out like the request for people to design some things for FieldKit from an illustration standpoint, the money they told us that they wanted was, we all thought was too cheap, so we actually paid them more than they were expecting. But it's really easy to find this sort of stuff. So you could take your product idea to the next level just by thinking about how do you do these sorts of things. We also went through like full packaging design. So if you buy a FieldKit, it comes in this really nice box with all this information on it. And then, with these kind of these printed materials that come along with it. And I think when you do things like that, it takes the effort and the work that you're doing to a different level in the eyes of a lot of people. It might not make a lot of difference to kind of a formal scientist or somebody who doesn't really care about anything except for the data, but it makes a huge difference to a lot of other people. And those people might be involved in actually paying you for your product. So it's important to kind of think about that. Another lesson I would say is don't wait too long to ask for help. We did that, right? So I would say that this is years and years ago. This is probably like 2014 or something, FieldKit 2013. But like, the time it took us to get from like breadboards to milled PCBs to actually printed PCBs to our own PCBs was a little bit longer than I think we should have taken in that time, because we didn't ask for the right sort of help. That's a lesson that we learned when we were thinking about enclosures. With respect to FieldKit, I wanted it to have its own enclosure. I wanted that enclosure to be useful for other things as well. And so we went through a full design process, and we actually brought in a very skilled mechanical product designer to help us think through what that ends up looking like. And so that's how we got to the FieldKit enclosure ourselves. But that entire process, including the manufacturing of that, was hugely important to have somebody who knew what they were doing when it came to injection molding, working with suppliers in China, and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's really important to kind of think about, if you don't know what you're doing about certain thing, don't be afraid to ask. The user part of it is actually absolutely huge. So we did a lot of work around user research, UI, UX. We tried to figure out what the overall product flow would be around FieldKit. And, that helps you identify what are the entry points. When are people coming to use FieldKit? Are they going to bring in their own sensors into the ecosystem? Are they looking at the data from a social media post? You think about all these different ways that people can actually come into the product that you're building, and that helps you design what sort of features you need or focus your efforts on what you want to kind of do moving forward. We did a bunch of interviews of people about what they would like to have with FieldKit. And we also did a survey. We created a survey and sent it out, and actually had like 1,200 submissions to that survey, which was way more than we even expected it. Which also an indicator of like the desire for something like this out here. And that helps you kind of think about what you want to build and where you want to focus first. In user research, there's this effort around creating these user personas, and these are kind of just imaginary people that you can think are using the thing that you're building, and what are their goals and their insights, and what do they care about. And you take a lot of this information, and it really helps you understand more deeply what you're building, but I think more importantly, what you should build first, and where you should focus on different areas. And so it's a process that might feel weird it felt weird to me as an engineer, but we got so much great insight out of it. And then we mapped out these user journeys. So understand people who are using FieldKit, what's the first thing they do? What do they do once they download data? How do you actually go through this whole thing and understand what are the points that the person might get frustrated, right? What are things that we can build in FieldKit that can help people through certain other things? You can even do these user journeys, and we did it with comparable products from other companies, and that can give you a lot of insight. Oh, I hate how this company does X, Y, and Z, so we're going to make sure we solve that problem. But the user thing, there's lots of different users that you kind of have to think about. And so it's easy. These processes are created to try and help wrap your head around all that, because in the end, it's the person who's using your product that actually matters, because they're the ones who are going to make or break what it is that you're creating. The next thing I'll say, I'm getting close to the end, but understand the business. It's important to kind of map out what it looks like do market research, know who else is building these sorts of things, find segments within that market that are maybe easier to reach, and understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the products that are currently out there. That really helps you to understand what kind of differentiates the thing you're trying to build. Finding the right funder is super important. We were very lucky in the main funder for FieldKit, because I told them that I wanted to build FieldKit the right way, and they understood that. It's a funder that comes from the tech space, but now does environmental stuff. So that might help. That might be the sort of thing, because finding a funder that maybe comes from the environmental space or conservation space or other areas might not understand the complications involved in tech development. The next thing is find a way to get people your product. We built our own shop for FieldKit, but there's other ways. I think AudioMoth has shown to be very successful with using group gets. You could sell your products on Amazon even if you want to, but this all goes into understanding the margins and the pricing, which I'll talk about in a second. But it really do what it makes the most sense for you. It's a lot easier too sometimes to go with someone else building your project if they're going to end up doing the fulfillment and all that stuff. We do all that stuff in-house, and it's a huge amount of work to try and make sure you have inventory. And it's even more complicated if you're a nonprofit like we are. So we have to track expenses and things like that at a much more fine level. You could sell a product as a nonprofit, but there's more implications around how you track things. And shipping and all sorts of stuff and that sort of thing. The pricing thing is a very hard thing to do. It's hard to figure out what your pricing is. Basically you look at what the other people are selling things in the market. You understand how much it costs you to build it, and that's the full build. That's the full cost of bringing something to the user, from you building it all the way down to marketing and all the stuff that's involved in that. But for us, we're a nonprofit and we don't take a lot of margin. So we have to figure out a way to make it sustainable using other means. And so FieldKit's business model is a little bit more complicated than we sell a bunch of stuff, and then that funds the operation of the organization. But this is something to kind of think about. One of the biggest things that we've run into is tax and customs issues, particularly as a nonprofit. So, if you want to ship things to other countries, which we very much want to do with FieldKit, FieldKit's tagline is FieldKit is for everyone. So I want anyone in the world to be able to buy FieldKit, but that's super hard from a tax and legal standpoint, and we're working through like figuring out what all that means. But even like selling in your own country, there's also weird tax implications to think about. So, this was something I didn't expect to be a big thing, and turned out to be a huge thing in 2020 that we're working through. And then the work doesn't end when the product ships. So, you have to think a lot about customer support. We have customer support and operations and community managers all kind of working on that sort of issue. But people are going to do things to your product that you would have never expected anyone to ever do, in a good way and a bad way. And so you have to figure out ways to kind of respond to that. And so it helps to have a way for people to contact you and say, hey, this isn't working, and so that you can help them kind of in a quick way. Okay. Absolutely need a project manager. I'm not going to go too much into this, but Susan is our project manager, and she kind of makes or breaks the project just in terms of like keeping us all on track. It's fantastic. It's the most important role of building a product. There's also legal things to think about. And so we work with a legal firm called Foley Hogue that's working with us on a pro bono basis. But even creating things like terms and conditions, your privacy policy, guarantees, stuff like that are all documents that have to be generated for a product that you're selling to the public. There's a lot of work too around security and data privacy. So we're within that Hackaday community, we work with people who are focused very much on this from a hardware standpoint and a software standpoint. So we have people come in and kind of audit the things that we're building to make sure that people can't like mess up the data or hack into it in ways that are going to damage things. But that's a big effort. It might not be as important in what you're building. It all kind of depends on what you're doing. Scientific rigor is important. We hired Pete, who's like a fantastic scientist and engineer, and really puts everything through its paces and makes sure that we could test our hardware against commercially available hardware, and that our calibration processes are up to snuff and everything. And so it's really important to kind of think about that. And finally, the last thing that I'll talk about is manufacturing. Those decisions depend very much on what your internal capabilities are. We do a lot of building in-house, but we have a pick and place machine, which you see here kind of going through it, that can build small quantities of things, but it moves fast. We have since kind of moved on to a small batch manufacturer to build a lot of our other boards. Sometimes, with things like group gets, you can have them build it for you. But we also we use things like restaurant trays to organize a lot of our builds, and that's a kind of a useful hack. You could see them here for the stuff that we end up doing. But yeah, I mean, deciding on where you want to build it has its positives and negatives, whether you want to do it in-house or you want to subcontract it out to a place like China. But there's also complications in terms of the supplier management and how you deal with all that. So, okay, that's it. I'm done.
Oh boy. Okay.
Sorry.
Shah, that was wonderful. No, that was wonderful. And we've had a heap of discussion tracking along with lots of questions and people agreeing with the main points that you're saying. So that was a wonderful, wonderful talk, and going to be great to have it as a resource for other people as they're coming through and turning projects into products. Okay. Where should we start? I don't even know. There's so many points that we could dig into first. But actually, before I get started, how big's the field kit team now?
I should know this right off the top of my head, but we have 4 people who are kind of in the engineering and development side, and that's both software and hardware. We have a QA person, a community manager, a project manager, fulfillment and kind of inventory lead, and then there's a network of kind of part-time folks or consultants that we work with on more kind of specific details of the process. So yeah, it's around, I think I would say I would probably put the field kit team at around 12 people.
And it's taken you quite a few years to get to that point, right? You're really echoing a normal startup's trajectory, even though you're in the specific conservation sector. It's quite a common piece of just like how you moved through this process, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of how that's how we've been thinking about it, is like, okay, let's pretend we're a real startup, but we're also a nonprofit, and and we're funded by grants. And so like, we there's like implications around that and how we do things. But yeah, I mean, we've been bringing on people when the funding makes the most sense to do so. And, some of the people we hired, there's a few people that we hired during the pandemic that we've never met in person. We've only done this virtual thing. So.
Yeah, super. I mean, I think we're all kind of familiar with that, but it's really interesting to hear. Okay, before I hand over to our audience, I just have one last question. Like, one of the things that we wonder about a lot is, well, we talk about a lot is the carrying capacity of the conservation sector for technology projects. And like you talked about, finding the right end users and buyers of your product is really important. Do you think there's enough space in the conservation sector to carry a lot of projects like yours, or is the solution doing what you've done and going, okay, we can serve the conservation sector, but we can also serve the environmental sector, and looking for the adjacent sectors so you can get to that critical mass of a market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it totally depends on your technology, but that being said, I think you're not going to find a huge customer base solely in the conservation sector. It also kind of depends. I mean, some people want to build a product, but they're professors at a university, or they have another job. They're not really trying to build something into its own entity, but they'd like to build a product. In those situations, 100%, yeah, conservation can support it. If you're trying to build up a medium-sized team and create these sorts of things, then like FieldKit, then no, I don't believe so. I think you have to look a little bit outside of that. But the good thing is there's a lot of other industries that have a lot more money that interface very kind of closely with conservation, right? There's the whole municipalities, city environmental monitoring sort of thing, agriculture. There's all these other industries that like you might be able to do a small tweak on your product and make it available to those sectors, and those sectors can help you pay for the work you care about. That's kind of the model I've seen other people do.
Yeah. Okay, Sam, do you want to jump in with your question?
Hi, Shah.
Hey, Sam.
Where are you joining us from?
London.
Oh, I thought so. It's just anyway. Keep going. What's your question? How are you doing?
I'm good. It's good to see Shah again. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing good.
No, that was awesome. Thanks so much for that, Shah. I wish I'd seen that 5 years ago. Might not be doing this now. What I'm interested in is how you open source the system, but at the same time, manufacture it. So if I'm just if I wanted to manufacture a FieldKit using the open source instructions, is it actually viable for me to do that for a company? Do you reckon?
Yeah, it actually is. I mean, we're doing FieldKit. This is part of I think the weird caveat behind FieldKit as a business model is we're not, we're taking smaller margins than everybody told us to take, right? We're completely open sourcing everything. So if somebody wants to build a FieldKit, they're going to build a FieldKit. Part of my mission with FieldKit is just to kind of demystify a lot of the stuff in the environmental sensor space. A lot of these things are proprietary for no real good reason, or they're expensive for no real good reason. So if FieldKit is successful, we're breaking down those barriers, and that might mean some of our products are made by other people, but I don't see that as a bad thing. I think, if other people want to make some of this stuff, that's great.
Can I just follow up on that, Steph?
Yeah, go for it.
Just like if someone goes and builds a FieldKit system and they have, technical issues with it, would you still support them with it, or do you just sort of say, sorry, we didn't build this set, so we don't know if it's been built to spec type thing?
Yeah, no, we will certainly support them with it. I think that when I was talking about the tech users and supporting those users, and I said, we have like the kind of the regular users and the people who want to hack into FieldKit, and so there's this whole tech support side of things that we're building out right now with the documentation and kind of mechanisms to do so, and so we will 100% support someone who wants to do that. I think that's kind of in the nature of what we're trying to do with FieldKit.
That's really cool. Thanks, Carl.
All right, next up is Lucy, who I think had about 20 questions. So if you want to consolidate into 3, maybe, I don't know. You're asking questions that are completely relevant and like match a lot of mine. So, have the floor for a little bit.
I'm happy to limit it because there were loads of other people asking questions as well.
Fine.
But I'm curious to know a little bit more about the business model and where your funding is coming from. Well, rather, what proportion of it is funded by funders and grants and other kinds of philanthropic support, and what proportion of it comes from sales, and are there any other sources? And is that a division that you set up right from the beginning, or did it evolve?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So right now we're all grant funded. So there was the plan in 2019 and 2020. I built a big financial model around like, this is how many field kits we have to sell to keep keep the organization running. This is how we'll find revenue for grant projects and blah, 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 and all this sort of stuff. And then, the pandemic hit, and we were supposed to launch FieldKit initially on Earth Day of 2020, and then decided not to because like everybody was worried for their lives, right? So, and then kind of we're in this weird point where, yeah, we've sold field kits, but we haven't really tried to push selling any field kits or done anything in that sort of thing. So in my ideal state moving forward, the way FieldKit would operate would be we would have a fair amount of revenue that's coming in off of the sales of hardware. All our software products are completely free. And right now we're actually building in ways for, like, say, the data portal to be used by people who don't have FieldKit sensors. So if you have your own sensors and you want to use that data visualization, you could do so. Then other funding would come from grant projects with other partners. And so, we have a lot of people come to us to say, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z in this place, and we need all these sensors, and we'll go in together on a grant from some organization. So we'll have some portion of that's actually grant funding. And then there's another portion of funding that we have coming in right now that is people who are interested in building their own sensor modules onto FieldKit or adapting FieldKit in a certain way. So there's some engineering effort that would be paid, would bring in some money to run the organization as well. So kind of our business model is those 3 things together would create a situation where we can kind of keep the team running and the lights on. And it's not, I would say largely because of the not selling things because of the pandemic thing, that business model has not been proven. So maybe in 2 years, like, you'll come to me and I'll say, that was a failure. That doesn't work. But that's what we're trying for.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And it's also just really good to see how you're experimenting and using that lean approach. Just one more focused question on the illustrators that you've worked with. I love the illustrations. How did you find them? Where did you find them? And how did you work with them? Did they already know about conservation, or how do you get them to give the right feel to the illustration?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We just found them. I think the ones that we use, we just found them on Twitter. Andres, who did those ones that you saw, someone on our team followed his Instagram and liked the things that he did. But there's websites you can go to find illustrators as well. What we did was we had a meeting with them. We kind of explained the concept and gave them videos and pictures, and really made sure that they understood the kind of the principles around what we wanted to build, like the accessibility and openness, and we wanted it to feel like it wasn't this kind of stodgy scientific tool that scared people away and all this stuff. And so that's all those thoughts went into it. And I would say there was a couple iterations around, we like this, we don't like this, but it got to a point where we have a really great relationship with that person now. And when we have something come up, we're like, okay, let's design some illustrations around this milestone or this thing, and then and so we reach out to them for more work. So, but I would say the first we actually paid like 4 different illustrators to go off and create their own like idea of what FieldKit would be, and then we picked that one because we liked it the best.
That's so interesting. How you don't have to answer this, but how much did you put up for the first, like, that little scoping phase? Because you said it was a lot cheaper than everyone would expect.
Yeah.
So,
God,
do you know ballpark, like a couple of
I do not know.
hundred, a couple of thousand? No,
I
that's
don't
fine.
remember. Yeah, I don't remember, but I do. What it wasn't. I wouldn't. It wasn't like a cup. I don't. Yeah, I don't remember. I do. I do remember when they told us our rate, we doubled it. So,
Yeah.
you know, that tells you that it wasn't like $15,000, right? So,
Yeah.
but I don't remember off the top of my head, unfortunately.
I have a question for actually the group here. A lot of what has brought everyone together here has been this, and a lot of the interest has been around the business model side of this and the runway and the funding and finding out like customers and all of that sort of stuff. So if you would be interested in us running more detailed like events or like developing content or getting different speakers in on this sort of topic or running courses or workshops, can you let us know? Because it's really helpful for us to know if that's of interest, because yeah, that's a side thing. Nat,
It's also, I mean, just sorry, just to kind of build a little bit on what you're saying, like it's really important too, because you know, I think a lot of funders give out like, you know, $20,000 grants for conservation tech, and then, you know, you have to understand what that can get you and what that can't get you, right? And so it's hard to really think about that, particularly once you get into like software, right? Software engineers are paid ridiculous amounts of money.
Yeah.
So like that's a hard, you can have a whole talk on just how to find the right people to help you with what you're doing, because that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. Do you mean like building the team or just
building
like
the team? Or even help, even like, you know, there's volunteers that have helped us on certain things that could help other people. I mean, there's a lot out there, you know, in that space.
Because I know, like, in a similar ways to what you've benefited, we've benefited hugely from having business advice and people helping us work on like how to stitch together the small grants so that you get further along, or how do you stitch together the different funding sources and get yourself to a point where you have a product and can have a bit more sustainability. Anyway, right, Nat, you're up next. You may have the floor.
Thanks, Steph, and thanks, Shah. That was like a fantastic talk, and I feel inspired as well as very daunted by all the information that you provided, because we're still at the kind of early stages of research and development, and similar to you, like we're trying to create a handheld paper-based species detection device that is very user-friendly and is affordable by all. And we're trying to decide whether would you recommend bringing on, like, if money was not an issue, would you recommend bringing on a product designer really early on in the research and development, or is it someone that we can kind of wait till further down the track to bring on? And on top of a product designer, if money wasn't an issue, who would you bring on like during research and development to help bring it from R&D to product to manufacturing to
that's a really good question. I would suggest, and one thing we did, which I thought was really useful, was we brought in, just on like a contract, you know, a short-term contract basis, we brought in a product developer that also was like a UI UX expert and kind of had an idea about how to do market research. It was like this kind of a person that we found her kind of, our project manager used to work with her at another firm, and she just came in to help us a little bit wrap our heads around what we were trying to build and the questions we had to ask and the things that mattered in terms of users and what we were trying to create there. And that set us down like a kind of a path where we didn't need her for the user interviews. We didn't need her for some of like the design work that we were doing, but like she gave us the framework in a time when we didn't even know what that framework looked like. And I think that's important. I think it's important to bring on someone like that, even just for a short period of time, like just to help you figure out what you have ahead of you.
That's fantastic. I'll
I mean, I'll also add that, like, giant companies hire product design firms for like their products all the time, and pay them obscene amounts of money. So I mean, there's real value in that, in thinking about what you want to create and how it's going to be something that is going to, have a life beyond what your initial project is. And so, it's easy to kind of discount a lot of maybe some of the stuff that I talked about in this presentation, but I really, really honestly, I want to stress the importance of like understanding that sort of stuff before you even move down to like, oh, let's build this feature, or let's do this X, Y, and Z, or this is what it looks like in terms of our product development roadmap. And the other thing I'll add too is, like, once you have some of that information, and if you show that information to a funder, they love it, because nobody does that sort of stuff in this space, right? Like, if you say, hey, listen, we've talked to 100 users and this is all blah, 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 they're like, wow, okay, this person is actually like putting in their diligence early on to understand what they're building before they actually go and build it. So, I mean, I think that has helped us in getting funding in places where we weren't, where we didn't think we would get it before. So.
Can I back that up and say that doesn't just go for hardware and software and tech products? That goes for like conservation projects. We've had similar, and like doing user interviews and doing the work and taking that sort of approach for how we design our programs has like been similarly successful, especially when talking to funders, but also just so valuable having a user like a UX or a service designer working with you to just ask you questions and work through that process. Like, if you can find that as soon as possible, it will set everything else up and make it so much easier.
Yeah, I agree with you, Steph. And yeah, good advice, Shah. I think sometimes we can become so focused on the research and development. I'm a conservation scientist, that's my focus, that we forget about, how do we actually take this from research and development to a product, and who are our end users going to be, like Steph said, and actually talk to the end users early on before we've even designed the product. What is going to be a good product design for our potential end users, etc.
All right, David, I can see your little face. Would you like to jump in with your question now?
Yeah. So I'm wondering how your conversations have gone with people who are already pretty invested in some sort of like hardware or software ecosystem, right? They already have a couple dozen of whatever, kind of sensor they're using. And have your conversations gone with people trying to like convince them you should supplement with FieldKit for your work, or you should replace whatever you're already using with FieldKit? Because like, if you're kind of a new player in a space full of products that have been around for 5 to 10 years in some cases.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I would say, I've had a lot of those conversations with people, and I'm not super concerned about that to start with. I would say, like, I focus more on how we can build FieldKit into something that value is apparent, without me having to try and sell it to somebody who has spent a lot of their grant income on another system, right? So, what I've found is that there's still a huge amount of potential users out there for this sort of stuff, even beyond like those kind of people who've been in that space for a long period of time. And as that is out there, and as the data gets published, and one of the things that we have with Pete is like writing journal articles and like things like that we're publishing around the work that we're doing. That body of work is going to help to convince some of those people as well. But with FieldKit, like, one of the things that we think about is like there are a huge amount of scientists out there that would love to do this sort of work, but can't afford the traditional systems that are out there. And that's a market that, in my mind, is fully open, and that we're trying to think about. So like, we're maybe not selling to, I mean, we're still working with big US universities, but like, we're thinking about how do we work with universities in other parts of the world that maybe don't have the same sort of grant income that a Yale has or something like that, right? So I mean, that's sorry, I would just add to, like, your question gets very difficult depending on what you're building too. Like if you're building something that only works for a certain subset of people and that subset of people have something that they like better, that's a tough thing to do. And I don't have a huge amount of insight other than like, try to prove them that your thing is valuable through actual real world, use of it. But yeah, it can get hard.
I realize we're on the hour. Shah, do you have like 1 or 2 minutes more to take the last few questions?
Yeah, I can stick around.
Okay, I realize other people might leave, so people might have to leave on the hour. So just a reminder, next week we've got another open source project that's Open Collar. It's all about open source tracking devices. So if you're interested in I think they're slightly earlier stage than you are, Shah, but if you're interested in this sort of how do we build community around different technologies and get them to product, it's another model that's going on, and another one to come along to. So Ellie's just dropped the link so you can register for that for next week's talk. There's two more questions that I'll throw at you, and I'll read them out because the question askers don't have mics. But this first one, quite a few questions as people were registering, and I know these questions follow you around as well because of the career that you've had. There's been a lot of questions around like, how did you build this career into conservation tech? Like, how do you make the transition? How do you find an ethical engineering career? One person asked. How does it? How do you transition from technology into conservation technology or technology into business? What's your advice there?
On how to make that transition?
Yeah, or like, and is it just one person with lots of skills before you find, or is it about finding the right team?
Yeah. I mean, finding the right team is very important. I think it's a mistake that a lot of people try and make is they try and be the everything. Like, I'm going to do all of this. I'm going to do the project management. I'm going to do the electrical engineering. I'll do the testing. And that can work for a very short amount of time, and then it becomes very limiting. It really restricts the amount of what you're able to do. And so, kind of making that transition from, oh, this is the thing that I'm working on that I'm interested in, to like, I'm going to create a company that does that sort of thing, or it's a lot of learning as you go, right? Like, I mean, we've made a huge amount of mistakes. I would say, like, on if you look at the entire arc of my career, it's been more mistakes than successes. But I've like learned so much on that thing that like I'm okay with that, right? I mean, as an engineer, you want to learn from mistakes and problems and keep on moving forward. So yeah, I mean, I one thing I would say about building a team, yeah, it can get pretty expensive. There's a lot of people who are excited about this sort of work because it's interesting and leads to opportunities to be in the field, and there's a lot of engineers that would love to kind of help and support that. I don't know if there's a good mechanism of finding volunteers who want to help you with your project other than just kind of by luck, right? Is you find the right person. When we first started and we didn't have a lot of funding, there was a lot of, I had another job when I first started doing this sort of thing and did this stuff on nights. And, Jacob, who is like the FieldKit's principal engineer, he did the same, right? Would volunteer his time as we were trying to build this stuff out. And it slowly gained enough momentum, and we found funding that allowed us to both leave what we were doing and focus on this full time. And then there was a long period of time where it was just me and Jacob, and then we could like grow the team slowly as we had more successes and gained larger grant amounts and things like that. We've worked with a lot of volunteers. Some volunteers have been fantastic and really great, really excited about the project, have like come on to become basically part of the FieldKit team. Other volunteers, that you rely on have disappeared. There's like, volunteer management is its own sort of thing that is like quite hard to do. But there's a lot of benefit you can get out of somebody who, is getting paid by someone else that can contribute to you because they believe in your mission. And I think there's ways to do that are not exploitative and really kind of bring the person in on what you're trying to do in a way that's genuine. But I think the path, it would be interesting to talk to people who have conservation tech organizations, like all the different people out there who have done it and how they've gotten there, like what's their path looked like, because I think it'd be rather different for everyone, right? It'd be
yeah, but it's also so funny how similar it is as well. Like the path you have to go through about getting funding and bringing the team in slowly is just the rite of passage to get there. Interesting. Okay, one final question with a bit added on from me. Joy asks, as a product guru, from your perspective, what are the top areas in conservation tech ripe for disruption? And then I'll final one to add on to that.
Oh God, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know what I think. Obviously, there's a lot of interest. It's a hard question to answer because I think that there's a lot of interest in certain types of conservation technology, right? Huge amount of interest in kind of acoustics and camera traps and anything related to ML and AI.
eDNA.
Yeah, eDNA, right? So, but I don't know how much of that interest is kind of sustainable. I think about drones, years ago, like how there was a huge amount of interest in drones and how many of those drone projects are kind of continuing on in a more sustainable sort of way. So I would, instead of saying like, what are the areas most for disruption, I would probably more so focus on what are things that you're personally interested in. And if it's something that you don't know a lot about at this point, I would learn everything there is about, X, Y, and Z. So you're really into acoustic bird monitoring. Learn everything there is about acoustic bird monitoring, understand who the people are in the space, the tools that they're using, the headaches that they have. There's a lot of people in all different research spaces that would talk your ear off about the work that they do and their own research. So listen for as long as you can until you find something that you find that little gap that you're like, oh, this feels like something is missing here. And that's what I would like to kind of pursue. I would probably say like that is the better way to go around it, because this process, as you may have could tell from my presentation, is not easy and it's long, and you really have to care very deeply about the work that you're doing, or it's not going to work. It's not going to be successful.
Yeah, that's really wonderful advice. And my final question is, and we like to ask this of all of our speakers, just as an ending question, what's making you feel optimistic and hopeful looking ahead and going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I'm like incredibly optimistic about the conservation technology space in general. There seems just to be so much excitement, and what makes it a little bit different now, nowadays, is it feels like there's like a lot more rigor that's going into things. And so people are, I feel now, asking the right sort of questions that maybe we should have been asking years ago when everyone was just kind of, oh, tech, it's conservation. I think we're getting to a deeper level that's going to create projects and products and programs that I think are going to be really push the needle in terms of where we sit in the conservation space. And I think like this is something we very dearly need, just because, all the indicators show that things are not going our way as we move forward, right? I mean, I live in California. It's basically on fire all the time. And we have all sorts of issues, oil spill that happened not very far away from me right now. So we have to kind of think about how do we create these things and do it with an urgency and a level of scientific and technical rigor that is actually going to push the needle on these sorts of things. And conservation technology, the general space, feels like it's very much in that right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, Shah, and sharing just such a well thought through guide to all of the lessons that you've learned along the way. It was really valuable. So thank you for being our surprise speaker, and we'll see everyone next week.